Thank you.
So, as I mentioned some moments ago, that I feel extremely thankful towards Ranvai. The fact that this presentation would not have happened, if Ranvai would not have talked to me, say, a year ago almost, or 9 months ago, and thanks to Marlin. And Marlin introduced us, and here I am presenting about my research. So as Mariana rightly pointed out, that my research interest includes this comparative research between Norway and India, wherein I'm comparing labor market experiences of young adults with visual impairments from Oslo and Delhi. So it is specifically Oslo and Delhi, and it's specifically young adults with visual impairments. And I will be focusing on two things in this presentation. First is the barrier perceptions, and the second is what kind of factors or strategies help these young adults with visual impairments overcome the barriers which they encounter in the labor market. So the idea of this presentation is to somehow voice the opinions of young adults with visual impairments from Oslo and New Delhi. So let's start from the beginning. Yeah. So the first slide, this is about the background and the facts about disability. So as we know, there are approximately 1 billion people with disabilities around the world, and out of these billion people, 470 million people with disabilities are of working age. And when we drill down on the statistic, we find that there are approximately 180 to 220 million youth with disabilities around the world. And if you look at their employment situation for these people, it's generally not very good. They encounter a lot of barriers. Some of these barriers are attitudinal in nature, some of them are physical, access related in nature. So the point is this, that you might be in Norway or United States or Germany or UK or India or Mozambique. There's some barriers which you might find which will impact the employment opportunities for people with disabilities, which are prevalent. It's not easy. Access to labor market is not easy for people with disabilities. And so there are research which shows that almost $1 trillion are lost to the economy of the world because of exclusion for persons with disabilities from the labor market. And we all know the significance of employment, because employment is not just means to earning a livelihood. It's not just the fact that, okay, I am working and I get my paycheck and I am financially independent. No, it's much more than that. It gives you a sense to participate in the community. It makes you active citizen. Rune will talk about it later in his presentation. It makes you more politically active, more engaged, much more contributing member of the society. So it's very, very integral element. So one has to work towards making a society which includes persons with disabilities in the labor market. So what's the situation in Norway and in India? So as you see here, the employment rate for persons with disabilities in Norway is hovering around 43% since the early 2000s, and it is 30% lower than the general employment rate. And this rate has stayed stable in spite of the fact that Norwegian economy boomed, or there was a very good growth period in the last decade. And what do we see about the people with visual impairments situation? So their employment rate was 32% in mid-1990s as compared to 70% in the general population. Their employment rate in 2014 was 46% as compared to general population employment rate of 78%. So you see that there's a huge disparity between the employment rates. And there have been previous assessments which has said that Norway is quote unquote mediocre when it comes to including people with disabilities in the labor market. There are a lot of good policy measures, but like researchers like Jan Kasebro and Bjorn Vinton have and of course Rune as well, have assessed that many of these measures have not worked to the most desired effect. And what's the situation in India? So in India, the employment rate for persons with disabilities in early 1990s was 42.7%. It went down to 37.6% in early 2000s, and it came down to 36% right now, as compared to general employment rate, which is 55%. So again, there's a huge disparity. And at present, there are only less than 1% of people with disabilities are in the labor market. And the same story holds true for youth with disabilities. Only 1% of youth with disabilities can actually participate in the formal sector labor market. And this has a huge implication for the on the economy. The 5 to 7% of the economy is shaved off because of the fact that youth with disabilities cannot participate in the labor market. I must say that these statistics are merely a heuristic tool. They are used as a they're not directly comparable. It's not like I am comparing the statistics in a very hard sense. What I want you to get with this presentation is that the employment situation for people with visual impairments and youth with disabilities is not very good. That's the broad idea. So these statistics, as I said, like they're definition and computational challenges, so they cannot be directly compared. But yeah, one has to be cognizant of the fact that their situation is not very good. Okay, so the key pointers of the research, like what I'm going to answer in this presentation, what if any similarities exist among the barrier perceptions encountered by young adults with visual impairments? The age group is 20 to 35 years, and what kind of employment strategies or factors help these young adults with visual impairments get into employment? Because it's not only necessarily okay to talk about the barrier perception, because then that goes into the quote-unquote misery research, or poverty research in the sociological sense, that you're just talking about the barrier-centric approach. So this is more in a much broader sense. And I interviewed 29 young adults with visual impairments from November 2018 to June 2019. 12 were from Oslo area and 17 were from New Delhi area. And I have used concepts such as the social model of disability, disabilism, capability approach, capability theory, and social resilience strategies to better understand the barrier perceptions and the strategies which the youth use. So, and I'm pretty pragmatic in my outlook towards the research. My idea is to come up with knowledge which is going to be useful. It's not knowledge for the sake of having a knowledge. And in the same way, I'm not relying too much on high theory. The idea is to be a bit more inductive, bit more engaged with the data, understand the data, what I'm listening, the stories I'm hearing on the ground, and then see if things could be argued in a systematic way. Yeah. So okay, this slide is about theoretical ideas. We can discuss this in the question and answer session, but the broad idea which I want you to take is many of you already understand that impairment is understood in a very biological way and disability is understood in a very sociological or societal way, that it's disability which leads to oppression and exclusion because the society has not taken care for persons with disabilities. Society is not given enough priority, and the same was true for disabilism. The idea is that there are assumptions which are conscious and unconscious, and there are practices which aim to differently treat or unequally treat people with disabilities just because of the fact that they have a perceived or actual disability. So these concepts we can revisit in the discussion. Some demographic data, like of the participants whom I interviewed, as I mentioned, there was almost an equal gender representation, 15 men and 14 women from both Oslo and New Delhi, and they all, as you see in this, for those who don't see, the idea is that there are these young adults have 21 of them have employment, and there are seven of them in private sector, public sector, and government sector jobs, and they predominantly have higher education. So this is not your run-of-the-mill young adult with visual impairment in an Indian context who fails to secure higher education. So this is a kind of a very small niche group of people and their experiences. Yeah. So the first major idea is this now. Similar barrier perceptions in two dissimilar countries, and I talk about three barrier perceptions which which will be interesting to discuss. The first is employers' discriminatory behavior, linked to that. The second is linked to the low social expectations, and the third is linked to the inaccessibility of infrastructure, ICT, and transport arrangements. So the point is this, that if you understand this slide, there are two buckets. One set of barriers are the barriers related to the attitudinal aspect, and the others are linked to the access aspect. Keep that in the back of your mind whilst I'm going forward. So the first barrier, which I mentioned about employers' discrimination, I call it turning a blind eye to discrimination. And what I'm finding is these are the voices of young adults with visual impairments, and this is from three different stages. You know, the pre-interview stage, at the job interview stage, and at the stage when perhaps you have a work internship. So one of the persons, or like the common theme which came up, and which is best summarized by this one person, is that the moment you she ended up saying something like this. She is employed and partially sighted, and she said that she has talked to the people who have visual impairment in the past, and for instance, if a visually impaired young person gets a job interview call, and before the job interview call, a day before, he or she just calls the prospective employer and says, by the way, just to tell you in advance, I have visual impairment, or I'm blind or partially sighted, so that if I come there, you should not be shocked, you know. What she gets as a reply is that it is, you know, it's okay if you don't come for the interview next day. For instance, the idea is this, I'm paraphrasing, the theme which she is highlighting is that the moment you say that you have visual impairment, prospective employers become a bit reluctant. They say, there's no need for you to come. And if you hide, if you don't tell them that you have visual impairment and just go to the interview, you barge into the door, and then they see your guide dog, or then they see that you have a visual impairment, then the employers might say, yes, perhaps you're qualified, but how would you go to the toilet? You know, questions linked to that, and which are not necessarily job-related questions. So that's the pre-job interview phase. The same holds true in the job interview phase, wherein one of the other young participants, she ended up going to the interview, and she was always concerned that I should not describe my visual impairment up front. And what eventually happened is that the moment she gets found out in the job interview that she has visual impairment, the job interview gets over really fast. At the work internship place, there are perceptions that people with visual impairments have some other disabilities, like mental health issues. So prospective employers, at least in the case of this one person, they started talking really slowly to her and in a very loud voice. So these experiences are very suggestive. What I'm trying to get at is that, and the reason why I would like to share it with Anna, you and Kristen, that perhaps you could enlighten me if this resonates with stories which you have heard or you have understood in the Trondheim context. Yeah. So moving on to the New Delhi context, like it's the similar-ish kind of story. So at the pre-interview stage, one of the persons whom I interviewed, a blind person, unemployed, says to me that employers, they have made this perception in their head that we cannot do anything. You know, we're good for nothing. At the job interview phase, the moment a person knows about the fact that you are blind, one of the persons says that my interview lasted for 30 seconds. I went inside the door and I came out, kind of situation, because they realized that this is never going to work out. And the third person, about at the workplace, this whole idea about in the Indian context that we have a very strong employment quota system in India for government sector jobs. So the basic idea about the quota system is that there's affirmative action. So if you have a disability, you have a right to get into employment in the government sector. And the same holds true for other minority groups. So the basic attitude towards of the employers, which many youth participants said, is that they want to give you donation. They want to hire you, if they hire you, as an act of charity, but not necessarily because they want you. So that's at the job interview phase. So okay, the common themes which have come up in the job interviews are five. One is explicit form of discrimination based on rejection based on okay, you have visual impairment, sorry, don't come here, this organization is not for you. Polite form of rejection, we see that you have nice qualifications, but perhaps you have found someone better to work at our organization. Then there is potentially a disability hierarchy. Many young adults ended up talking that they feel that they don't get the job as compared to other disability groups, So that's really interesting. And then of course they talked about the prejudices which are prevailing in the labor market against people with visual impairments. That people are very fearful, and they ask questions such as, as I mentioned, can you find the toilet, and so on, which are not very relevant. And there is a huge amount of literature which talks about the fact, both from Oslo and New Delhi, which says that employer discrimination is a real phenomena. Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs has acknowledged it. There are people who have tried to tabulate it and say that it happens, but it's very hard to decipher it because it is in the Norwegian context. It's often hidden behind the veil of qualifications. Like it's politely said that no, you don't, you are not allowed here because you don't have the qualification. But yeah, and in the Indian context, it's much more explicit, and discrimination takes place, and there's a lot of unconscious bias and misconceptions. And this is a worldwide phenomena, as I mentioned in the end, which there's a lot of good research from United States which tabulates this issue. The second issue which I said, so this was the first issue about the employer's discrimination, the perceptions. Second issue is about meeting the low social expectations. And now what do I mean by low social expectations? That society consists of a lot of actors. When we grow up, we don't come into a world and it's a vacuum. There's the aspect of family, school system, NAV, and general societal interactions, for instance, to name a few. And these actors, their expectations from the young adults with visual impairments could determine what kind of employment opportunities they find for themselves. So what I found, which was very interesting, is that overprotective parents is a huge issue for many young adults with visual impairment. They said that if our parents expected poorly from us, it was very hard for us. We felt that we were too dependent whilst growing up, and we did not learn the active daily living skills. And eventually we were not able to, it was harder for us to find employment. Similarly, as I mentioned, educators, one of the youth, Nine, she ended up saying, she's vision impaired on disability pension, saying that my teachers always thought of me that I should take the safe option because they thought that I could not do anything better, or I could not have it better than what I was potentially capable of doing. So that kind of story emerged often. Similarly, for welfare bureaucrats, I don't know, perhaps you people can enlighten me about it later in the Q&A section, that this whole idea that wherein a young adult with visual impairment interfaces at the age of 18, 20 with the NAV system, and the NAV people say, why do you have to go to Oslo? You don't have to go to Oslo. We can give you a disability pension from a small town in Norway. And one of the youth, he ends up saying that there are some people who need the disability pension and they deserve it, and and it's good that they get it, and it has to be adequate and sufficient for them to have an independent, engaged life. But at the same time, some people are not necessarily wanting it. They don't need it, but they are pushed into it. Pushed is the right word, which he used many times. And he, in his assessment, there are some things which are more evil than that. So he thinks it's a very evil thing, which now ends up doing, pushing people forcibly into disability pensions at a young age. Similar kind of low expectations, societal low expectations from in regular interactions. How do you, like, are you able to find a toilet in your apartment? I don't know, there's a bit of an obsession with blind people not able to find toilets. That's what I have realized. So yeah, low expectations coming to the Indian context. Like if you see, like it's a similar story. Parents in the Indian context, they could be really protective, that you don't have to go outside, we would take care of you. You want some food, you want clothes. One of the women participants, she said that my parents said that you want food, you want clothes, we'll give you everything. There's no need to go outside. What's the point of going and living alone? And that kind of affected her life chances or opportunities into the labor market. Similarly, there were other young adults who talked about the parents being very over-possessive. In the case of India, the role of welfare bureaucrats is rather limited, and most of the needs for young adults with visual impairments are provided by their parents. So, but again, the point was this, that they had a very negative assessment of the policy implementation. They were not happy with what government was doing for persons with disabilities in general. And when it comes to the educators, it was a similar kind of issue. The teachers thought that the moment you have a visual impairment, perhaps you have some other intellectual impairments as well, and you are a weak student. And when it comes to societal interaction, the same story, similar kind of stories about really low expectations. Yeah. So as I said, that from a systemic point of view, if one takes a bird's eye view of the phenomena of low expectations, one finds that it is very deep rooted. It goes at different levels in the society. So family, education system, bureaucracy or bureaucrats, and the societal interactions in general. And that's a huge problem. And there's a lot of research on this low expectations as well, which says that persons with visual impairments from both Oslo and New Delhi, they encounter huge issues with low expectations. And there's a lot of international data as well on this front. That was the second major barrier perception. The third one is called as access denied. Yeah, so ICT and transport arrangements, as I said, like one of the youth participants was invited to a job interview, and before coming to the job interview, he was told that you will have to go to a mandatory training. And he said, okay, I can attend the mandatory training, but everything which had to be done in the mandatory training was in a format which was inaccessible, was in a hard copy format. So he said, I cannot participate in this training. And then the employer said, okay, then you are not hired. Then we will not invite you to the interview. So he was kicked out from the process because of the fact that the employers could not make these things accessible in time for him. Okay. Another issue which happened for a young adult who was youth 9, she ended up talking about the fact that how she would use her own magnifier at her workplace, and her own magnifier at the workplace would not work well with the softwares at the workplace, and would have a lot of problems. And this was a problem which she encountered not just in one work internship, but in multiple work internships. So the key takeaway is that, okay, that employers either they don't invest sufficient resources perhaps, or they don't want to invest sufficient resources when it comes to finding accessible solutions for young adults with visual impairments. And transport arrangements, I think for people who have visual impairment, this is often a major challenge also. Some of the youth participants mentioned this, that how they could not take up jobs because the jobs required them to change buses, or it was too far away, it was too energy consuming. So they said, okay, this is much harder to do, so I cannot take that job. A similar story took place in the Indian context. What happened is that if you see, there are stories about the job access with speech, a screen reader software not being compatible with the office softwares which are there. So that was one of the things which came out. And generally speaking, the accessibility of websites or web portals, because now often jobs are posted online. You don't find the advertisement in newspaper, or you don't get into jobs through those other means. So the online access is a huge issue for people with visual impairments or young adults with visual impairments. And when it comes to the transport arrangements, it was a similar issue. Like the female participants mentioned that it was very hard for them to commute, and there was issue of safety. This, however, I must say, was a much more pronounced phenomena in the Indian context. Transport for women with visual impairment was considered a lot more hassle-some as compared to all the male participants. That was kind of like a diverging thing which was observed. And these were the themes which I just mentioned, that there was inaccessible ICT, which is incompatible ICT systems, and inaccessible public transport arrangements, leading to low employment opportunities. Next is like, this is the evidence from both Oslo and Delhi. There's a lot of research which has been done, Björken et al., which talks about the transport arrangements, and Lunde and Anderson and Scott will talk about inaccessibility issues for young adults. So now that was the talk about, here we are with the barrier perceptions, 3 barriers. First being employer discrimination, second being low social expectations, and third being inaccessibility issues. So do the young adults with visual impairments, in the light of these barrier perceptions or these barriers, sit at home, or what do? How do they engage with these barriers? Do they try to negotiate it? So what I found is that there is a bit of social resilience which is taking place. There are 3 strategies: coping, adaptive, and transformative capacities. One of the pictures, there are two pictures have the title adaptive, one of them is wrong. So imagine there is a picture of a woman with a smartphone who is saying that I want to go to my friends or colleagues' dinner place, and I'm going to book a taxi, on the smartphone. And this was, perhaps it seems very banal in the Norwegian context. Yes, of course, we have smartphones and we have access to internet and we have taxi services. But this phenomena is very recent in the Indian context, in the New Delhi context, wherein these young adults now are able to book these ride-share services like Uber and Ola. And again, let me remind you that this is not necessarily true for all young adults with visual impairments. This is a very privileged select group. But for that group, this coping strategy has helped them tremendously to mitigate the perverse effect of, say, transportation barrier, or to not take the jobs which they could have previously taken. Just an example. In the similar vein, adaptive capacities have been used wherein, young adults with visual impairments are taking a long view of their life and saying, what is going to help me get into employment in future? So in the past, if you became blind, and in the Indian context, out in Norway, I'm not explaining that more, but it'll be much more intuitive if you understand the Indian context. So in the Indian context, if you become blind, then your family says, okay, now you're going to stay at home, and that's it. That's the end of your education, and we'll take care of you. And so that's the life story. But now, young adults with visual impairments are getting access to primary education, but compulsorily by free primary education, which is available, and they are getting more connected with disabled people's organization and so on, and they're able to migrate and, say, for instance, use scribes or braille or some other assistive technology to take exams. And by doing that, they're able to be better prepared and adapt their situation to enter into the labor market subsequently. And the final aspect is the transformative capacity, which is like, here we are talking about the fact that young adults with visual impairments, and one of the major issues is about a link to low social expectations, is that if you have a disability, the broad idea is that we should take care of you. We have to be compassionate towards you. And by we, I mean the society, the quote-unquote non-disabled society. Let's put it like that. Let's put it in a binary context, although it's not necessarily true, but let's put it like in that context. So the major idea is that, yes, there are disabled people, we have to take care of them. But what I am finding is that these young adults with visual impairments, they have desire to contribute back to the society. Like any other youth, they are full of energy, they are full of ideas, they are full of, they have volunteering capacities. So they end up engaging with the wider audience, and somehow add value and meaning to their lives. Stories from Oslo, it's pretty self-evident. The first one is coping mechanism, which I mentioned, or coping capacity. This whole idea about being solution-oriented or using technology very smartly. That I know I have visual impairment. I know I have to use magnifiers. I've tried all the magnifiers from Hjelpemiddelsentralen, and I know this one works best for me. And with this one, I can write very well on computers, and I would use that. That kind of, initiative taking. Again, with the help of other factors like Hjelpemiddelsentralen. That very important. Similarly, adaptive capacity. This whole idea about, okay, I want to get into employment in future. What will help me? Perhaps if I get work internship, I don't want any blank spaces in my CV. So let me do those work internships during the time when I'm at the university. The third thing about the transformative capacity, I have the opportunity to perhaps volunteer for example, Norges Blindeforbundet, for functions med det felles organisation, unge functions med det, and other such organizations, and see if I could add value. Because I want to engage with other people with visual impairments. I don't want to be quote unquote an isolated person.
The light just went.
We need to move around in order to get the light.
There.
Oh, there you go.
Keep back.
Okay, that's okay. Thanks for telling me. Well, I'll just continue it. So and coming back to, for instance, so in the Indian context, a similar kind of stories wherein, you know, like as I mentioned that when young adults with visual impairments, they turn blind, they are learning more braille, learning assistive technology, and this is helping them to finish education and eventually get into employment. That's the coping mechanism. The adaptive mechanism is again on the similar lines wherein people say that if I don't have internship, then I will not be able to express my value to the organization, or the employers might not be able to understand how valuable I am. So I better get the work experience in advance. And when it comes to like in the Indian context, there are organizations such as the Blind Graduates of India, for which many people volunteer, and they engaged in the idea of creating a quote-unquote level playing field or equal society for people with disabilities, doing self-advocacy work. That's the transformative capacity. So potential factors which can help young adults with visual impairments get into employment, like as I mentioned, personality features, which is important but not significant. It's vital. You have to take risk, be extroverted, have a desire to be more independent. Family, extremely important. Have balanced expectations and give support to them. Like concluding education, very, very vital. You know, like getting good support from the teachers and the family members. Doing work internships, getting experience, improving the skills, adopting technology. That was also very important, which came up. And last but not the least, this whole idea of participating in the civil societies, being mentors to other young adults with visual impairments, helping them learn the tools of assistive technology and so on. So yeah. So these are the limitations of this whole presentation or the whole PhD. As I mentioned, it's only 29 young adults with visual impairments, 12 from Oslo area, 17 from New Delhi area. This is not representative. This is a very select group. This is rather a very privileged group, I would say, because they have somehow managed to make it into employment or into higher education and are kind of living a much more independent life. And that's not the true story or a reflective story for people with visual impairments around the world. Most of the people with visual impairments around the world, as I mentioned, don't get access to labor market. The figures are really abysmal at a worldwide level, and most of them, they have these barriers to live with. So that's the major limitation. I have not focused on the supply side factors. Sometimes, you know, or not sometimes, often people with visual impairments could have health related issues, they could have multiple other disabilities, and they could not have education completed their education. So those all barriers are there, and I'm not undervaluing those barriers, and I understand that those barriers are very vital to discuss. But from a comparative Norway, India, Oslo, New Delhi exploratory perspective, the idea was to understand what could be similar, if there could be something similar. And that's much more informative and thought-provoking. So that's why it was not focused on. And of course, when I talked about the employer's barrier perception, employment barrier perception, I only mentioned about the young adults with visual impairments. How do they perceive the barriers? I did not talk about the barriers perceived by the employers. For instance, employers might just say, we don't find young adults with visual impairments who are qualified in Norway. They could say that, and that's their perception. Or the welfare bureaucrats can say, I have tried getting this person, this young adult with visual impairment into a job for past 9 years, and this is not working. So those stories, or the family could say, we don't want our child to work, we have a lot of money saved, and we just want him to inherit that money. So those perceptions are there, which are very vital, which can stop people or young adults with visual impairments to get into labor market. So those are not explored in the study. That's very important. So yeah, and as I mentioned, the concluding remarks would be about the three things. First, the fact that there are similar barrier perceptions which are found among young adults with visual impairments in both Oslo and New Delhi. These barrier perceptions are similar despite of the fact that these two countries are completely different on every conceivable macro level factor. Second factor is that the young adults with visual impairments don't give up or don't just sit at home. Once when they encounter these barriers, they make active efforts, they're supported by their families, they're supported by their other social networks to engage with these, to negotiate these barriers. And finally, as this is the most important thing, this is an exploratory research. It is not a definitive work. It has to, there has to be a lot more research which is quantitative in nature, longitudinal in nature, which should explore all these aspects from different angles. But someone has to start somewhere. So this is just a starting point, first starting point. Thank you.